The destruction of the One Ring marked the end of Sauron's reign of terror over Middle-earth. With the Dark Lord's power broken and his influence fading, many have wondered what became of his vast armies, particularly the Orcs. These creatures, bred for war and driven by malice, were suddenly left without a master. In this video, we'll explore the fate of the Orcs after the fall of Sauron, diving into the lore of Middle-earth to uncover what became of these dark creatures. After the One Ring was destroyed, the downfall of Sauron triggered a catastrophic collapse within Mordor, the dark stronghold that had served as the heart of his empire. Without the guiding and oppressive force of their master, the Orcs, who had been bound to Sauron's will through fear and dark sorcery, found themselves suddenly leaderless and without purpose. The immediate aftermath was one of chaos and destruction. The towering Black Gate, once an impenetrable barrier, crumbled along with the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr. This physical collapse mirrored the internal disintegration of Sauron's armies. The Orcs, bred for war and conditioned to obey Sauron's commands without question, were left in a state of complete disarray. For centuries, these creatures had known nothing but the lash of their master's will. And now, with Sauron's fall, that will was gone. The Orcs, lacking any central leadership or unifying purpose, turned on each other in a brutal display of their inherent violence and savagery. The stronger Orcs sought to establish dominance, leading to vicious infighting as various warlords tried to carve out their own territories within the ruins of Mordor. However, these power struggles were short-lived. Without the overarching authority of Sauron, the Orcs lacked the discipline and organization to sustain any lasting leadership. The dark sorcery that had held them together began to dissipate, and the once mighty legions of Orcs fragmented into small, warring tribes. These tribes, driven by hunger and fear, began to scatter across the desolate plains of Mordor. Some tried to escape the cursed land, seeking refuge in the mountains or attempting to return to the dark forests from whence they had been dragged by Sauron. But the world outside Mordor was now hostile to them. The forces of Gondor and Rohan, emboldened by their victory, hunted down any Orcs they could find, determined to eradicate the remnants of Sauron's army and ensure that no threat would rise from Mordor again. Meanwhile, within Mordor itself, the land began to change. The dark clouds that had long shrouded the land in perpetual gloom began to disperse. Sunlight, long absent, pierced through the clouds, revealing the barren and scarred earth below. The land, once sustained by Sauron's malevolent power, began to wither. The few Orcs that remained in Mordor found themselves in a dying land, where survival became increasingly difficult. Deprived of their dark master, many of the Orcs succumbed to starvation, disease, and infighting, their numbers dwindling rapidly in the face of insurmountable odds. Beyond the borders of Mordor, the fate of the Orcs varied depending on their location. In Isengard, where Saruman had bred his own army of Uruk-hai, the fall of Sauron had a profound impact. Saruman too had been defeated, and the remnants of his forces were scattered. The Uruk-hai, bred for war and devoid of any higher purpose, were left leaderless and lost. Unlike the Orcs of Mordor, who had long been under Sauron's influence, the Uruk-hai were a relatively new creation, and their fate was swift and brutal. The forces of Rohan and the Ents, who had played a crucial role in the downfall of Isengard, hunted down the Uruk-hai with relentless determination. Bereft of leadership and purpose, these creatures had little chance of survival, and most were destroyed in the immediate aftermath of the war. In the Misty Mountains, the Orcs that had long plagued the region found themselves similarly at a loss. These Orcs, who had been led by various chieftains and warlords, were cut off from any central authority with the fall of Sauron. Though they had not been directly controlled by the Dark Lord, the Orcs of the Misty Mountains had been bolstered by his presence, knowing that a great power stood behind them. With that power gone, these Orcs were left to fend for themselves. Some attempted to continue their raids on the free peoples of Middle-earth, but they found themselves increasingly outmatched by the newly united forces of men, elves, and dwarves. In some cases, small bands of Orcs managed to escape into the wilds, hiding in remote caves and forgotten corners of the world. These survivors lived a desperate existence, far from the power and glory they had once known. They were no longer a significant threat, but rather a lingering pestilence that occasionally troubled the free peoples. Over time, even these remnants would fade away, either destroyed by those who hunted them or dying out due to the harsh conditions of their exile. Despite the widespread destruction of the Orcs in the immediate aftermath of Sauron's fall, some managed to survive in the long term, though in greatly diminished numbers. These survivors were scattered and leaderless, living in isolated pockets far from the centers of civilization. In the absence of Sauron's dark magic, the Orcs had to rely on their own cunning and brutality to survive. Some retreated to the darkest and most remote regions of Middle-earth, such as the deep forests, the forgotten tunnels of the Misty Mountains, or the desolate lands to the east of Mordor. In these hidden places, the Orcs eked out a meager existence, relying on their ability to scavenge and their deep-seated instincts for survival. They became nocturnal creatures, avoiding the light of day and the eyes of the free peoples. Over generations, these Orcs became more reclusive and degenerated even further from their already savage state. Their once organized war bands devolved into primitive tribes, each led by the strongest and most ruthless among them. These surviving Orcs also faced the challenge of finding sustenance in a world that had turned against them. With the lands around them no longer corrupted by Sauron's influence, food became scarcer, and the once abundant prey they had hunted was harder to find. Some tribes turned to cannibalism, preying on weaker members of their own kind to survive. Others raided the occasional isolated village or farm, but such attacks were rare and risky, often leading to the Orcs being hunted down by local militias or rangers. As the Fourth Age of Middle-earth began, the world was increasingly dominated by men, and the Orcs found themselves even more marginalized. The great kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan, along with the elves and dwarves, worked to cleanse the land of any remaining threats, including the scattered bands of Orcs. The Orcs' numbers dwindled further as they were hunted down, and those who survived did so by becoming even more elusive and retreating into the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the world. In some cases, it is possible that small communities of Orcs managed to persist for centuries, surviving in the dark corners of Middle-earth where no one dared to go. These isolated groups would have lived in a state of constant fear and desperation, always wary of discovery by the free peoples. However, without the dark magic that had originally created and sustained them, the Orcs were ultimately doomed to fade away, becoming little more than a dark legend in the histories of men. By the time of the later Fourth Age, it is likely that the Orcs had either been completely exterminated or had degenerated into such a primitive state that they no longer posed any significant threat to the world. Their once fearsome numbers were reduced to mere handfuls, and their legacy as a force of darkness was all but forgotten by the new generations of men who inherited Middle-earth. As Middle-earth transitioned into the Fourth Age, The world underwent profound changes. The age of men had dawned, and with it came the decline of the old powers that had once shaped the destinies of all who dwelt in the land. The elves began their long journey to the west, leaving Middle-earth to the dominion of men. The dwarves, too, withdrew into their mountain kingdoms, their influence waning as men expanded their realms. In this new world, the orcs, if any survived, found themselves in a vastly different environment, one in which they were no longer the fearsome soldiers of a dark empire, but instead remnants of a fading past. The orcs, creatures of darkness and violence, were inherently tied to the power of their creators. Sauron, who had bred and commanded many of them, was gone, and with his destruction the orcs lost their unifying purpose. In the new age, where the light of men shone brighter than ever before, the orcs struggled to find a place. Unlike the previous ages, where they had been marshaled as armies of destruction, the Fourth Age presented no such opportunities. The Great Wars were over, and the world was at peace, leaving the orcs as relics of a bygone era. In this new world, the orcs were largely regarded as pests and monsters to be eradicated. The free peoples of Middle-earth, particularly men, who now held sway over much of the land, viewed them with disdain and fear. The orcs had been instruments of terror for so long that their presence, even in diminished numbers, was not tolerated. Those who survived the initial purges following the fall of Sauron were hunted relentlessly. The Rangers of the North, the soldiers of Gondor, and the riders of Rohan all took part in campaigns to rid their lands of any lingering orcish threat. The once proud legions of orcs were now reduced to small bands, hiding in remote forests, mountains, and caves, living like animals, constantly on the run. In some regions, particularly in the wilds of the east and the far north, isolated pockets of orcs managed to survive for a time. These orcs were far removed from the centers of human civilization and could avoid detection. However, their existence was bleak. Cut off from any hope of resurgence, they devolved into a state of primitive savagery. The orcs, once disciplined warriors under the iron fist of Sauron, became nothing more than feral creatures, fighting each other for scraps of food and territory. They no longer had the means or the will to organize into large groups, and their numbers dwindled as they succumbed to infighting, starvation, and the harsh elements. For those orcs who tried to adapt to the new world, their efforts were largely in vain. Some attempted to integrate into the fringes of human society, either by force or by stealth. These orcs might have tried to settle in abandoned ruins or caves near human settlements, scavenging what they could. However, their efforts were met with hostility. Men who now had the strength and unity to confront any threats to their new order did not tolerate the presence of orcs. Any discovered were swiftly dealt with, either driven off or killed outright. The orcs, with their monstrous appearance and violent tendencies, could never hope to be accepted into the societies of men. They were remnants of an evil that the world wanted to forget. The changing environment of Middle-earth also played a role in the fate of the orcs. With the departure of the elves and the waning of magic in the world, many of the dark places that had once provided refuge for orcs became less hospitable. The forests, once dense and foreboding, began to lighten and thin as men cleared land for agriculture and settlements. The deep caves and tunnels in the mountains, where orcs had once thrived, became targets for mining and exploration. As men expanded their territories, they encroached upon the hiding places of the orcs, leaving them with fewer and fewer places to escape to. In the face of these challenges, the orcs became more desperate. Their raids on human settlements became more frequent, but also more reckless. These attacks were no longer part of a coordinated effort to conquer or destroy, but were instead driven by sheer desperation for food and resources. Such raids often ended in failure, as the Orcs were ill-equipped to face the organized defenses of the human towns and villages. Each failed raid led to more losses, further reducing their numbers and morale. The Orcs that survived into the Fourth Age became increasingly marginalized, retreating to the most inaccessible parts of the world. In these hidden places, they clung to a shadowy existence, a far cry from the fearsome legions they had once been. Some Orcs turned to ancient superstitions and dark rituals, hoping to call upon the remnants of Sauron's power or the favor of other dark entities. However, without the guiding hand of a Dark Lord, these efforts were futile, and the Orcs found themselves abandoned by the very forces they had once served. As the years passed, the Orcs continued to fade from the world. The men of the Fourth Age, with their burgeoning kingdoms and growing populations, saw to it that the Orcs were driven to extinction wherever they could be found. The memory of the great wars against Sauron was still fresh, and there was no room for mercy. The Orcs, who had once been the terror of Middle-earth, became little more than a myth, a dark tale told to frighten children. Their once mighty fortresses were reclaimed by nature or repurposed by men, leaving little trace of the creatures that had once inhabited them. In some remote corners of Middle-earth, it is possible that a few Orcs survived, living out their days in obscurity, far from the reach of men. These survivors would have been reduced to a pitiful state, living off whatever they could scavenge, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. Over time, even these last remnants would have likely disappeared, their bloodlines ending in solitude and despair. The Orcs, who had been created for war and destruction, could not survive in a world that no longer had a place for them. The Fourth Age was an era of peace and prosperity for the free peoples, and in such a world, the Orcs were anachronisms, relics of a dark past that the world was eager to leave behind. By the time the Fourth Age fully matured, the Orcs were gone, leaving behind only ruins, legends, and a reminder of the darkness that had once threatened to engulf Middle-earth. In the end, the Orcs' fate was sealed by the very nature of their creation. They were beings of malice and hatred, tied to the will of dark powers that no longer existed. Without those powers to sustain them, the Orcs had no future in the world of men. Their end was not marked by a great battle or a final stand, but by a slow, inevitable decline into obscurity and extinction. The Fourth Age, the Age of Men, was not their time, and as the years passed, they became nothing more than a distant, fading memory in the annals of history. The eventual end of the Orcs in Middle-earth was a gradual process, marked by the inexorable passage of time and the changing nature of the world. The Orcs, born of dark sorcery and bred for war, were never meant to thrive in a world without the darkness that had given them purpose. As the Fourth Age advanced and the power of men grew, the Orcs found themselves increasingly out of place in a world that was moving toward peace, prosperity, and the restoration of balance. In the aftermath of Sauron's fall, the Orcs were scattered and leaderless, their numbers significantly reduced by the wars and the relentless purges carried out by the forces of good. The great battles that had defined the previous age were over, and with them the need for vast armies of Orcs had vanished. Without Sauron to guide them, or Saruman to command them, the Orcs were left to their own devices, and their inherent tendency toward chaos and violence only hastened their decline. The free peoples of Middle-earth, particularly the men of Gondor and Rohan, took it upon themselves to cleanse their lands of the remnants of Sauron's forces. This included not just the orcs, but also other creatures of darkness such as trolls, wargs, and the corrupted men who had served the Dark Lord. The orcs, who had once been a fearsome and disciplined force under Sauron's command, were now reduced to small, disorganized bands. These groups were no match for the seasoned warriors of Gondor and Rohan, who had honed their skills in the wars against Sauron and Saruman. The orcs, once feared for their numbers and savagery, were hunted down with ruthless efficiency. In the years following the destruction of the One Ring, King Elisar, Aragorn, and his allies focused on rebuilding and restoring peace to the lands that had been ravaged by war. Part of this effort involved rooting out any remaining threats, and the orcs were high on this list. The lands of Mordor, once a stronghold of darkness, were reclaimed and cleansed. The plains of Gorgoroth, once teeming with orcish legions, became a desolate wasteland where only the hardiest of creatures could survive. The Black Gate, the entry point to Sauron's realm, was destroyed, and the ruins of Barad-dûr were left to crumble, a testament to the end of Sauron's power. As the years turned into decades, the remaining orcs found themselves increasingly isolated. The great forests, such as Fangorn and Mirkwood, which had once provided cover and refuge, were now under the watchful eye of the Free Peoples. The elves, before their departure to the west, ensured that their realms were safe from any lingering threats. In places like the Misty Mountains and the arid Luin, the dwarves continued their ancient task of delving deep into the earth, and any orcs that had taken refuge in these dark places were either driven out or destroyed. The orcs' dwindling numbers meant that they could no longer rely on strength in numbers to intimidate or overpower their enemies. Their attempts to raid villages or ambush travelers became increasingly rare and were met with swift and often deadly reprisals. The orcs that survived became more cunning and desperate, resorting to guerrilla tactics and relying on their knowledge of the wilds to evade capture. However, these efforts were largely futile in the long run. The forces of good were now united and determined to ensure that no remnants of Sauron's evil would remain to threaten the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Over time, the orcs' isolation grew more profound. They retreated further and further into the wilds, avoiding contact with the Free Peoples. In their desperation, some turned to cannibalism, preying on weaker members of their own kind or scavenging the remains of battles long past. Others attempted to survive by raiding isolated homesteads or farms, but these attacks were increasingly rare and risky. The men of the Fourth Age were vigilant, and any sign of orcish activity was met with swift retribution. The orcs' attempts to rebuild their numbers were hampered by their own nature. Bred for war and violence, they lacked the knowledge and skills needed to sustain a stable society. Their crude attempts at agriculture or animal husbandry were doomed to fail, and without a Dark Lord to provide for them, they struggled to produce enough food to sustain themselves. The harsh conditions of the wilds, combined with their own brutal tendencies, led to further declines in their population. As the centuries passed, the orcs became little more than a memory, a shadow in the dark corners of Middle-earth. The tales of their cruelty and savagery became the stuff of legend, told around campfires to frighten children. The ruins of their once mighty fortresses, such as Dol Guldur in Mirkwood, or the towers of Cirith Ungol, became overgrown with vines and hidden by the encroaching wilderness. The orcs, who had once been a terror to the Free Peoples, were now forgotten by all but the most ancient of lore masters. In the more remote regions of Middle-earth, it is possible that small, isolated groups of orcs managed to survive for a time. eking out a meager existence far from the eyes of men. These survivors would have been a pale shadow of their former selves, living in constant fear and desperation. Their numbers would have continued to dwindle as they succumbed to the harsh realities of their environment, inbreeding, and the relentless pressure of being hunted by the free peoples. Any such groups that did survive into the later Fourth Age would have been completely cut off from the rest of the world, living out their days in obscurity until they too eventually faded into extinction. The passing of time saw the world of Middle-earth change in ways that further ensured the Orcs' end. The rise of men and the decline of magic meant that the ancient dark powers that had once sustained creatures like the Orcs were no longer present. The Valar, having overseen the defeat of Sauron, turned their attention away from Middle-earth, leaving the world to men. The lands that had once been battlegrounds for the forces of good and evil became places of peace and prosperity. The ancient evils that had once threatened the world were now little more than echoes of a forgotten past. By the time the Fourth Age fully matured, the Orcs were gone, leaving behind only ruins and the occasional artifact to remind the world of their existence. Their extinction was not marked by any grand event, but was instead the result of the natural course of history. The Orcs, who had been created for a specific purpose in a specific time, could not survive in a world that had moved beyond that purpose. They were creatures of war, and in a world of peace, they had no place. The end of the Orcs is a testament to the resilience and determination of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Despite the darkness that had once threatened to consume them, they prevailed, and in doing so, they ensured that the Orcs and the evil they represented would never rise again. The world moved on, and with it, the Orcs faded into the mists of time, leaving behind only the memory of a dark age that had finally come to an end. In the end, the Orcs' extinction was inevitable. They were beings of darkness, and without that darkness to sustain them, they could not survive. The new world of the Fourth Age was one of light and hope, and in such a world there was no room for the creatures of Sauron. The Orcs, who had once been the terror of Middle-earth, became nothing more than a footnote in history, a reminder of the evil that had been overcome. Their story ended not with a final battle, but with the slow, inevitable decline of a race that could not adapt to a world that had outgrown them.